The year is 1919. World War I just ended. Young black soldiers are coming home on ships and trains, expecting something different. They'd worn the uniform. They'd fought in trenches. They'd bled for democracy overseas. Some came back with medals. Most came back with scars. All of them came back believing that maybe, just maybe, things would be different now. They were wrong. What they found instead was one of the bloodiest summers in American history. A summer so violent, so widespread, so deliberately brutal, that a civil rights leader named it the Red Summer. Not because of communism or socialism, but because of blood, black blood, spilled in the streets of more than 30 American cities between April and November of 1919. And here's the thing, almost nobody teaches you in school. This wasn't just racist violence. This was organized massacre. White mobs, often led by police, soldiers, and everyday citizens, descended on black neighborhoods with one goal: to terrorize, destroy, and kill. They burned homes to the ground. They lynched men, women, and children. They shot people in the streets. And for the first time on a massive scale, black Americans fought back. This is the story of the Red Summer of 1919, a racial reckoning that America has spent over a century trying to forget. Let's start with what was happening before the violence exploded. During World War I, hundreds of thousands of black Americans moved north as part of what historians call the Great Migration. They were fleeing the Jim Crow South, where segregation was law, where lynching was common, and where economic opportunity was essentially non-existent. The North promised factory jobs, better wages, and at least the possibility of living without constant terror. Between 1910 and 1920, Chicago's black population jumped from 44,000 to over 109,000. That's a 148% increase. In Philadelphia, the black population grew by 500%. By the summer of 1919, about 500,000 black Americans had resettled in northern cities. They took jobs in meatpacking plants, steel mills, and factories that had been desperate for workers during the war. But when white soldiers came home in 1919, they expected their old jobs back. Instead, they found black workers had filled those positions. Competition for housing got intense. Entire neighborhoods became flashpoints. And then there were the veterans. About 380,000 black men served in World War I. They served in segregated units, faced discrimination even while fighting for their country, but they also got a taste of something radical: respect. In France, black soldiers were often treated better than they'd ever been treated in America. They ate in the same restaurants as white people. They walked the streets without fear. Some even had relationships with French women, something that would get them lynched back home. When these men came back, they refused to go back to the old way. They refused to step off sidewalks when white people walked by. They refused to accept being called boy. They wore their uniforms in public, a visible symbol of their service, and to many white Americans, that was seen as a threat. A federal postal official wrote at the time, quote, "Since the Negro was fit to wear the uniform, he was therefore fit for everything else." In Texas, a federal agent reported that the returned Negro soldier, quote, "is not readily fitting back into his prior status of pre-war times." White America was terrified of black economic success, terrified of black political power, terrified of black men who'd been trained to fight and weren't afraid anymore, and so they lashed out. The violence began in the spring. On April 13, 1919, in Jenkins County, Georgia, white mobs attacked a black church, killing 6 people, including 2 white officers and 4 black men. It was a preview of what was coming. Then came Charleston, South Carolina, in May. White sailors, many just returned from the war, rampaged through black neighborhoods. They beat people in the streets. They destroyed businesses, and the police did nothing. But the real explosion happened in July. On July 19, 1919, Washington, D.C. erupted. Here's what sparked it. A rumor. Just a rumor. A white woman named Elsie Stefanik reported being assaulted. Police arrested a black man named Charles Rawls and brought him in for questioning. There was no evidence. They released him. But that didn't matter. White sailors, soldiers, and Marines, many still in uniform, formed what one historian called a mob in uniform. They descended on Southwest D.C., a predominantly black neighborhood. They pulled black people off streetcars. They beat them with clubs and lead pipes. They dragged people into alleys and lynched them. The police refused to intervene. President Woodrow Wilson, who'd segregated the federal government and screened birth of a nation in the White House, did nothing for days. So black residents, including thousands of World War I veterans, armed themselves. They stationed snipers on rooftops. They set up blockades around Howard University. They created defensive perimeters around their neighborhoods. When white mobs tried to invade, black residents fought back with guns, knives, bats, and anything they could find. The Washington Post, which had been publishing sensationalist stories about, quote, Negro fiends attacking white women, ran a front-page story on Monday, July 21st, that basically called for more violence. The headline announced a 9 p.m. assembly for servicemen to, quote, cause the events of the last 2 evenings to pale into insignificance. Black Washingtonians took it seriously. They armed up. That night became the bloodiest. Fighting raged across the city. The violence lasted 4 days. When it finally ended, at least 15 people were officially dead, though historians believe the real number was closer to 40. Over 150 people were injured. Federal troops finally arrived, but it was a summer rainstorm that really stopped the fighting. One of the first victims was a 22-year-old black veteran named Randall Neal. He'd survived the war in Europe only to be killed in the streets of his own capital. But Washington was just the beginning. On July 27th, just days after D.C., Chicago exploded. That morning was scorching hot. 5 black teenagers went to the lake to cool off. They built a makeshift raft and pushed off from 26th Street Beach, the only beach in the city technically reserved for black people. There was no law requiring segregation, but everyone knew the rules. The boys drifted. The current pulled their raft across an invisible line into water near 29th Street, the white beach. A white man named George Stauber started throwing rocks. He kept throwing. One rock hit 17-year-old Eugene Williams in the head. Williams, exhausted from treading water and dodging stones, drowned. Black witnesses on the shore pointed at Stauber. A white police officer, Daniel Callahan, refused to arrest him. Instead, Callahan arrested a black man on a minor complaint from a white person. That was the match. Chicago erupted. For 13 days, the city was a war zone. White gangs, including the Hamburg Athletic Club, loaded into cars and drove through black neighborhoods, firing guns indiscriminately. They set fire to tenement buildings. They hunted black people in the streets. But black Chicagoans fought back. Black veterans from the 370th Infantry Regiment organized defensive positions. They returned fire. They protected their neighborhoods block by block. The National Guard was eventually called in, but like in D.C., it was rain that finally cooled things down. When the smoke cleared, 38 people were dead, 23 black and 15 white. Over 537 were injured, two-thirds of them black. Between 1,000 and 2,000 black families lost their homes. George Stauber was charged with manslaughter but never convicted. Eugene Williams was buried in an unmarked grave because black people weren't allowed to be buried within Chicago city limits. The horror moved west. On September 28, 1919, in Omaha, Nebraska, a young white woman named Agnes Loback reported being assaulted. Police arrested a 41-year-old black man named Will Brown. He had chronic rheumatism and likely couldn't have physically committed the crime. But again, evidence didn't matter. The local newspaper, the Omaha Bee, ran a headline calling Brown a, quote, black beast. The paper had been publishing inflammatory stories for weeks, stirring up racial hatred, likely at the direction of Tom Dennison, Omaha's political boss, who wanted to discredit the city's reform mayor. On Sunday, September 28th, a crowd gathered. It started with a few hundred youths from South Omaha. By evening, between 5,000 and 15,000 people surrounded the Douglas County Courthouse where Brown was being held. The mob looted gun stores. They opened fire on the courthouse. They set it on fire and prevented firefighters from putting out the flames. When Mayor Edward Parson Smith tried to calm them, they beat him unconscious, put a rope around his neck, and tried to hang him from a trolley pole. Police cut him down just in time. Inside the burning courthouse, Will Brown pleaded with Sheriff Mike Clark. "I am innocent," he said. "I never did it. My God, I am innocent." It didn't matter. The mob broke in. They dragged Brown out, already beaten nearly to death. They stripped his clothes off. They hanged him from a lamppost at 18th and Harney. His body swayed as they riddled it with bullets. They cut him down, tied his corpse to a car, and dragged it through downtown Omaha. At 17th and Dodge, they piled railroad ties and lumber, threw his body on top, and burned it. Pieces of the rope were later sold for 10 cents each as souvenirs. Federal troops arrived that night and made arrests. Photographs clearly identified members of the mob. None of them were ever convicted. Will Brown was buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field. The death certificate listed his age as about 40, marital status unknown, birthplace blank. Cause of death: bullet wounds and strangulation. But the deadliest violence happened in rural Arkansas. In Phillips County, Arkansas, near a small town called Elaine, black sharecroppers were organizing. They'd formed a union called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. Their goal was simple: get fair wages and honest accounting from the white plantation owners who'd been systematically robbing them for years. On the night of September 30th, 1919, about 100 black farmers met at a church in Hoop Spur, just outside Elaine. They'd hired a white attorney from Little Rock named Ulysses Bratton to help them sue for stolen wages. They knew organizing was dangerous. They posted armed guards around the church. White law enforcement officers showed up. Accounts differ on who fired first, but a shootout erupted. A white railroad security officer named W.A. Adkins was killed. A deputy was wounded. News spread fast. By the next morning, white mobs were pouring into Phillips County from surrounding areas. They came from Tennessee. They came from Mississippi. They came armed with rifles and shotguns. Arkansas Governor Charles Breaux called in federal troops from Camp Pike, over 500 soldiers. But instead of stopping the violence, many of the troops joined in the massacre. For days, white mobs and federal soldiers hunted black people. They shot farmers in the fields. They dragged people from their homes and executed them. They burned houses with families still inside. Black residents who tried to flee were gunned down in the woods. The exact death toll will never be known. Official reports said maybe 25 black people died. Eyewitnesses said over 100. Modern historians believe the number was between 100 and 240 black people murdered. 5 white men died. Among the victims were the Johnston brothers. Dr. D.A.E. Johnston and Leroy Johnston were visiting from Helena and Oklahoma. Leroy had just returned from 9 months in a hospital, recovering from injuries he suffered fighting in France. He survived the trenches of World War I. He came home and was shot to death alongside his 3 brothers by a white mob in Arkansas. After the massacre, Arkansas officials created an elaborate cover-up. They claimed black people had been planning an insurrection. National newspapers ran with it. The New York Times headline read, "Planned Massacre of Whites Today." The Arkansas Gazette called Elaine a zone of Negro insurrection. More than 100 black people were arrested. 73 were charged with murder. 12 were sentenced to death, even though they were the victims. These became known as the Elaine 12. All white juries convicted them in trials that lasted minutes. No white person was ever charged. The NAACP stepped in. A brilliant black attorney named Scipio Jones took the case. After years of appeals, the Supreme Court ruled in Moore v. Dempsey in 1923 that the trials had been conducted in a mob atmosphere and denied due process. All 12 men were eventually freed. But the massacre itself was never prosecuted, and the violence didn't stop in Arkansas. Between April and November of 1919, white mobs attacked black communities in over 30 cities: Knoxville, Tennessee; Longview, Texas; Norfolk, Virginia; Bisbee, Arizona; Port Arthur, Texas; Charleston, South Carolina; dozens more. In every case, white mobs initiated the violence. In most cases, police either participated or did nothing, and in almost every case, black people fought back. Federal authorities responded by investigating not the white mobs, but black communities. The Military Intelligence Division and the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI, became convinced that black resistance was part of a communist plot. They blamed Bolsheviks. They blamed socialists. They blamed anyone but the white terrorists actually committing the murders. Intelligence officers worked with local authorities and gun dealers to block the sale of weapons to black people. They confiscated guns from black households. They arrested black people who defended themselves while letting white attackers go free. The government saw armed black self-defense as more dangerous than white mob violence. But black Americans refused to submit. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great civil rights leader and intellectual, wrote in the Crisis magazine in May 1919, "This is the country to which we soldiers of democracy return. This is the fatherland for which we fought. But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land." He'd written just months earlier, "We return from fighting, we return fighting." And they did fight. In Washington, D.C., black veterans created organized defense units. They stationed themselves as snipers. They coordinated defensive positions. In Chicago, veterans from the 370th Infantry Regiment led the resistance. In Charleston, one preacher said black men carried their guns, quote, "with as much calmness as if they were going to shoot a rabbit in a hunt." Jamaican poet Claude McKay captured the spirit in his sonnet, "If We Must Die," published during Red Summer If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot. Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. The poem became an anthem. It spread through black communities across the country. It spoke to a new consciousness, what some called the new Negro movement. Black Americans, especially veterans, were done accepting terror as the price of existence. The Red Summer had profound effects. NAACP membership skyrocketed from 9,000 before the war to over 100,000 by the early 1920s. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Crisis raised awareness and argued forcefully for the right to self-defense. The events galvanized the civil rights movement that would emerge decades later. But the violence also solidified segregation. In Chicago, the riot essentially cemented the boundaries of what would become the South Side Ghetto. Streets that saw violence in 1919 remained color lines for generations. Housing discrimination became even more entrenched. Economic opportunities remained limited. The riot didn't create Chicago's segregation, but it helped make it permanent. And here's what almost nobody talks about: how thoroughly this history has been erased. The Elaine Massacre, the deadliest racial violence in Arkansas history, and possibly in all of American history, wasn't taught in Arkansas schools until the 21st century. Eugene Williams' grave went unmarked for 102 years. A headstone wasn't placed until 2021. Most American history textbooks spend maybe a paragraph on Red Summer, if they mention it at all. The focus is usually on white veterans returning from war and labor tensions, as if economic competition somehow justifies massacre. The narrative frames these events as riots, suggesting both sides share blame, when the truth is these were organized campaigns of white terror. The language matters. Calling it a race riot suggests two sides fighting each other on equal terms. Calling it Red Summer suggests isolated incidents of unrest. But what happened in 1919 was coordinated white supremacist terrorism designed to keep black Americans in their place through murder, destruction, and fear. Think about the mechanics of these attacks. White mobs didn't just spontaneously form. They organized. They coordinated. In Omaha, the mob numbered between 5,000 and 15,000 people. That's not a spontaneous gathering. That's orchestration. In Elaine, white people came from surrounding states. They had transportation. They had weapons. They had federal troops backing them up. And the media played a crucial role. Newspapers in Omaha, Washington, Chicago, and other cities ran sensationalist stories about black crime for weeks before the violence. They printed rumors as facts. They used language like black beast and Negro fiend. They called for action. The Washington Post literally published the time and place for white mobs to gather. After the violence, these same papers blamed black people. They called the massacres uprisings or insurrections. They portrayed white mobs as heroes defending their communities. And the federal government backed this narrative, investigating black radicalism while ignoring white terrorism. The trauma from Red Summer rippled through generations. Survivors rarely spoke about what they witnessed. Richard Wright, who grew up in Phillips County, wrote in his autobiography, Black Boy, that when he asked his mother why their people didn't fight back, the fear that was in her made her slap me into silence. The terror was that deep. But resistance was also part of the legacy. Carrie Johnson, a 17-year-old black woman in Washington, D.C., shot and killed a white police officer who tried to attack her during the riots. With a black lawyer at her side, she argued self-defense and won. That was revolutionary. The organized armed resistance in 1919 set a precedent. It showed that black communities could and would defend themselves. That tradition of armed self-defense continued through the civil rights movement, even though it's often left out of the sanitized version we learn in school. Groups like the Deacons for Defense in the 1960s directly drew on the legacy of 1919. Red Summer also revealed the lie of American democracy. These were men who'd fought for freedom overseas, coming home to find they had none. They'd worn the uniform, served in segregated units, faced discrimination even while fighting, and came back to a country that saw them as threats rather than heroes. At least 13 black veterans were lynched across the United States after World War I, many while still in uniform. Leroy Johnston survived France only to be murdered in Arkansas. The message was clear. Military service didn't earn black American citizenship or safety. Nothing would be given. Everything would have to be fought for, and fight they did. The resistance in 1919 wasn't just self-defense in the moment. It was a declaration. Black Americans were done with submission, done with accommodation, done with hoping white America would grant them humanity. The Red Summer of 1919 didn't end racial violence in America. 2 years later, the Tulsa Race Massacre would destroy the thriving black community of Greenwood. Lynchings continued through the 1920s and beyond. Segregation remained law across the South until the 1960s. Police brutality, economic discrimination, and housing inequality persist today. But something changed in 1919. For the first time on a massive scale, black Americans fought back against white terrorism and survived. They organized, they armed themselves, they defended their homes and families. They refused to die like hogs, hunted and penned. The Red Summer was a turning point, not because it ended violence, but because it showed resistance was possible. It laid groundwork for the civil rights struggles to come. It proved that black Americans would fight for their freedom, even when the police, the military, and the government stood against them. This history matters because it's being repeated. The pattern of white mob violence backed by authorities, followed by official denials and rewritten narratives, has happened again and again in American history. Understanding 1919 means understanding how racial terror works, how it's justified, and how it's erased. The Red Summer of 1919 was one of the most violent racial explosions in American history. Over 30 cities erupted, hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed. Entire communities were destroyed, black homes were burned, families were terrorized, veterans were lynched, and the country spent the next century trying to forget it ever happened. But we can't afford to forget. We need to remember Eugene Williams, 17 years old, stoned to death for swimming while black. We need to remember Will Brown, lynched and burned in the streets of Omaha while thousands watched. We need to remember the hundreds killed in Elaine, Arkansas, for daring to organize for fair wages. We need to remember Randall Neal, who survived World War I only to die in the streets of D.C. We need to remember the veterans who stationed themselves on rooftops to protect their communities. We need to remember the families who fought back with whatever they had. We need to remember that resistance is part of our history, even when textbooks leave it out. The Red Summer of 1919 was a massacre. It was terrorism. It was an organized campaign to keep black Americans subordinated through violence and fear. and it was met with unprecedented resistance that changed the trajectory of the Black freedom struggle. That's the history they don't teach you. That's the summer America forgot. But it's time we remember. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.